Converted Man here. When we last left off, we had 10 logical fallacies, and the article had basically proven that there's no proof for God. Good job, article. Let's move on to Atheist bad argument number 3. God is not all-powerful if there is something he cannot do. God cannot lie, therefore God is not all-powerful. Bang! Owned! Not so fast. This argument would be fantastic, devastating maybe, if God was more of the ancient Greek god persuasion, where the gods themselves were subject to fate and limited to their specific roles in the cosmos. The Orthodox doctrine of God is much different. Christians, at least Orthodox Christians, view God's ontology as subject to his perfect free will. Why is he good? Because he wills to be good. Why does he not lie? Because he wills to be honest. Why does God exist as Trinity? Because he wills it. He could just as easily will to not exist. And, yes, he could just as easily will to lie. The fact that he doesn't is no commentary on whether he could. Well, amazingly enough, you had a special knowledge 6 times in there. So I guess this really only applies to Orthodox Christians, and every other Christian can just not have any way to respond to this argument, I suppose. So we have to assume that Orthodox Christianity is correct, and we have to assume that their doctrine is correct, and we have to assume that they're right about God having perfect free will, that he wills to be good, that he wills to be honest, that he wills to be the Trinity. And then we get some weirdness here. God could will to not exist, which is something I don't think I've ever read or heard anywhere, ever, from theism, at least Christianity, before. But maybe that's true. Maybe God could will to not exist. And then God could also will itself to lie. Now, there's several problems with this particular response. One, if God can lie, then we can't ever trust God, period. Secondly, if God can will itself to not exist, then how do we know that God still exists? In other words, God could have just said, screw it, I'm done with this, and stop existing. So, really, this poses more problems than it could hope to create as a solution. Basically, this is, well, God could do anything, it just chooses to not do anything. The typical response to this is that it's simply not in God's nature to lie, or it's not in God's nature to stop existing. Now, that still requires special knowledge of how God functions, but at least it avoids the problems that this response has ingrained inside of it. So, by responding in this way, he's actually solved all his problems with bigger problems. Okay, go. That's what that quote was from. You would only understand if you knew what I was talking about, which you might not. Moving on. Note: due to the immense amount of discussion that this point has raised, one clarifying statement is worth noting. An argument based on strict logical word games can render the idea all-powerful or omnipotent self-defeating. When one considers the juvenile question, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? The point becomes clear. But in reality, such an argument winds up further solidifying what Christianity means by calling God all-powerful. For the Christian, it simply means that all power and authority are God's. Following the logical word game above forces the believer to make a redundant proclamation in order to remain consistent. God cannot overpower himself. But this fact is anything but confounding. It merely stresses the point that there is no power greater than God, so much so that one is forced to pit God against himself in order to find his equal. So the answer is that God can't make anything greater than God, because if it could, then it wouldn't be God. Okay, so God cannot make a rock heavier than God can lift, because that would be something greater than God, and there is nothing greater than God. Therefore, God is limited in that respect, because God is the greatest thing that there can be, and therefore cannot do something that is greater than itself. It could clone itself and make a carbon copy of itself. It can make things lesser than it, but it can't make things greater than it, because there is no greater than it. Much better formulated response to the complaint or the question, can God make a rock so heavy that it can't lift? Which is really just asking the question, what is omnipotence really mean? Does it mean that it can perform logical contradictions, or does it mean that it can only do certain things within certain parameters? And if that's true, then we shouldn't call it omnipotence. We should call it something else. I don't know what the word would be. Maybe logically coherent potence. So that it can do anything that is logically coherent, but it can't do anything that is incoherent. Like it can't make a married bachelor or a square circle or something more powerful than itself. Just don't use the word omnipotence and you get rid of the problem. But for whatever reason, probably because of doctrine, they want to keep using the word omnipotence, even though omnipotence suggests contradictions, and the skeptics continue to point out that omnipotence would have contradictions in it, and thus cannot be an attribute of anything, even God. And this, quote, juvenile response, end quote, of can God make a rock so heavy it can't lift, is meant to point out the flaw of omnipotence. Although, again, as I said, there's a better way to respond to that particular question. But the real question is, can God do something that is logically incoherent? And if the answer is yes, then all bets are off because logic goes out the window. If the answer is no, then it's not omnipotent. It's logically coherent potent or something of that nature. I don't know. You make up a word for it. Moving on. Believing in God is the same as believing in the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and the Flying Spaghetti Monster. What I love about this well-worn atheist argument is that it actually serves to demonstrate how vastly different a belief in God is to these myths and imaginations. When one honestly assesses the Judeo-Christian doctrine of God, he will find multiple thousands of years of human testimony and religious development. He will find martyrs enduring the most horrific trauma in defense of the faith. He will find accounts in religious texts with historical and geographical corroboration, etc. These facts are, of course, not proofs, but rather evidence that elicit strong consideration. Pit this against tales of the Tooth Fairy, Santa, and the Flying Spaghetti Monster, and one finds the exact opposite. No testimony or religious refinement, no martyrs, no historical and geographical corroboration, etc. Instead, one finds myths created intentionally for children, for point making, or for whatever. It's a straw man argument at its worst. Okay, so just to make it clear for the viewers at home, the credentials to be considered as a religion, according to this article, are multiple thousands of years of human testimony. Okay? Religious development. Martyrs enduring horrific trauma, accounts in religious texts with historical and geographical collaboration. I can't say words. And that's it. So, basically, pretty much every religion that we have currently is equal to Christianity. Thousands of years of human testimony, religious development, martyrs, accounts in religious texts, historical and geographical corroboration. All of that can be found in pretty much every single religion to some extent or the other. Maybe not as many years for some, maybe more years for others. So all we have to do is say Zoroastrianism was before Christianity, lasted a while, I don't know, I think it's still around, not sure. Find out how many martyrs it has. Does it have to have more martyrs than Christianity to be true? You know, do their religious texts and religious development have to be greater than what do these credentials, how do they work to establish what is a true religion from what is a false religion? And then does that mean that if we got people to believe in the flying spaghetti monster for, I don't know, let's just say 1,000 years, and somebody, at least one person, got martyred for it, we got lots of people attesting to it, we write down some geographical references, would that then make the flying spaghetti monster equivalent to the Judeo-Christian God? I think that this response doesn't really get the straw man argument that's being made. And by that I don't mean that the argument is a straw man. I mean that he's saying something that is in itself a straw man. There's very few to know people that would say believing in God's the same as believing in Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and Flying Spaghetti Monster, although I have heard that. So I'll call it a potential straw man, and I won't count it. In fact, reading this particular paragraph, there really aren't any logical fallacies for me to complain about, other than the last statement, which is it's a straw man argument at its worst, which in itself is a potential straw man because the argument itself might actually be a straw man argument and not an argument that an atheist would make. But that's potential as well, so I'll just grant all of this and agree with him. The Flying Spaghetti Monster was created for a courtroom case to prove a point. The Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus, however, are lies that we create and we tell to our children, which I think personally is wrong, and we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't continue to do that. We shouldn't make up stories and pretend that they're real. We just shouldn't do that. And for some people that's a killjoy, but I really think that our duty should be to the truth. And simply put, telling kids lies is a way to make your kid distrust you. And I think that that's just a bad idea. Could God be equivalent to Santa Claus, for example? Around Christmas, usually a meme will pop up comparing God to Santa. And usually the checklists are pretty darn close. We can't see it. We can't verify it. We can't test it. We have to believe in it for it to be real. If you're good, you get rewards. If you're bad, you get punished, etc., etc. Is it a weak argument? Yeah, it's a weak argument. I personally wouldn't use it. I would use the lobsterist argument because obviously Laud is a far more real deity. We've had thousands of years of testimony of people that I don't know their names, but I'm sure that we have thousands of years and like 1 billion martyrs. And as far as historical and geographical stuff, yeah, I'm sure that that's there somewhere. Maybe not, but it will be when we find those writings. We just haven't found all the writings yet. So yeah, we'll show you. Alright, my reductio ad absurdum is done. And those are two more arguments that are bad. One of which had logical fallacies, and amazingly enough, the second one kinda doesn't. Believing in God could be like believing in the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, but nobody really believes in the flying spaghetti monster that I know of, so I'm going to leave that one out. But it's different. And it's different because of what it is and how it interacts with the brain. Whereas a kid will figure out that Santa is fake, and the parents will own up to it. And the kid will figure out that the Tooth Fairy is fake, and the parents will own up to it. If a kid figures out that God might not be real, and the parents believe in God, they're going to insist that God is real because that's their belief. So there is a difference. And I think it is a bit of equivocation to say that that believing in one is similar to the other. They might share some qualities. Now, if we took the Tooth Fairy and indoctrinated a kid to believe in it, and we kept saying it was real, and we built a following around saying that it was real, and we got enough kids involved who eventually grow up to be adults, the Tooth Fairy religion would become a thing. We could do that if we wanted to. And people have made cults based on some very strange things. So it's possible that we could create a cult based on the Tooth Fairy that eventually would become or be recognized as religion when it got big enough. And it would probably have martyrs, and it could have writings and history. That doesn't prove anything at all. Gone with the Wind has references to real places, but that doesn't make it a true book. These facts are, of course, not proofs, but rather evidence that elect strong consideration. No, they're not. Because if that statement is true, then all religions that have your criteria are equally plausibly true, and some of them have more than you do. So you need to refine this response in such a way that it actually addresses the real core issue, even though the question or argument itself is a potential straw man. The other one, however, there was logical fallacies in that one, so we get to be skeptical of that conclusion. Number 4, not so much. I have complaints about it, but I'm going to let it go. I don't really think it's an argument people do make, and if it is, stop doing it, because it's a bad argument. So that's it for the thing that I'm doing. And I have no bloopers because I didn't screw up, actually I did, but I deleted them because they weren't very funny bloopers. And I'll catch you next time in the next video. So, look forward to that. Or backwards to it. Or sideways, perhaps. I'm dragging on this video too long? Too bad. Look, I want to keep talking. You can't stop me from talking.